When the Berlin Wall fell, November 9, 1989, the spontaneous singing of Friedrich Schiller's poem on die Freude, Ode to Joy, was everywhere. Beethoven's Ninth Symphony setting of the words of Friedrich Schiller echoed in the hearts and minds of not only the German people, but people all over the world that felt themselves to be part of that moment. Something new, wonderful and beautiful seemed to emerge in that world at that time. The voice of Friedrich Schiller, the poet of freedom, can best resonate when a great opportunity confronts a people that, weeks or even days earlier, seemed unconcerned with history and what it takes to change it. Tragedy, such as that now unfolding before us, not only in Palestine, but in the United Nations, in the corridors of power in America and Europe, sometimes calls forth from the dispossessed, the disenfranchised, the insulted and injured, the best that is possible from humanity. At that time, it is the poet that gives voice to what sits, without words, on the souls of those that the world itself suddenly realizes do not deserve their unchosen fate, and were born for something better. The children of Gaza, in their undeserved suffering, torture, and death, require something better from the world, and from each of us. How must we act in the next days and hours to become as large as this moment of history requires us to be, if justice and freedom are not to perish from the earth?
Denn nur der große Gegenstand vermag den tieferen Grund der Menschheit aufzuregen. Im engeren Kreis verengert sich sein Sinn. Es wächst der Mensch mit seinen größeren Zwecken. Und jetzt, an des Jahrhunderts ernstem Ende, wo selbst die Wirklichkeit zur Dichtung wird, wo wir den Kampf gewaltiger Naturen und ein bedeutend Ziel vor Augen sehen, und um der Menschheit große Gegenstände, um Herrschaft und um Freiheit wird gerungen. Jetzt darf die Kunst auf ihrer Schattenbühne auch Höhenflug versuchen. Ja, sie muss, soll nicht des Lebens Bühne sie beschämen.
No one, to our knowledge, more perfectly embodied the humanist ideal of humanity. No one more effectively united the conception of Republican freedom with the principle of poetic beauty than Friedrich Schiller. What Beethoven was for music, Schiller was for poetry. Schiller and Beethoven were the giants of the German classics, infinitely alike in their method of thought, each having established the standards by which all art must henceforth be measured. Schiller was the great Republican poet of freedom, who could adorn the ideal of a nobler, more beautiful mankind in such powerful language that he truly found an infallible key to the most secret recesses of the human soul. Like no other, he could evoke the most tender emotions within his audience, enlarge its heart, and guide it to a level of reason not previously known, because he, like no other, met the challenge he himself posed to every poet.
Hello and welcome to today's Manhattan Town meeting for Saturday, November 11th. It's called Friedrich Schiller, Inspiring People to Be Greater Than Their Destiny. And we're recording this on November 10th, which is the birthday of Friedrich Schiller, born in 1759. In recent days, Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the founder of the Schiller Institute, has insisted that great ideas are the only solution to the insoluble paradoxes of war and peace that presently plague the globe. On November 9th of 1989, there was an example of exactly that. That was the day that the Berlin Wall fell. That wall had been built in 1961 and was internationally recognized as a symbol of the tyranny of dogma and ideology. In January of 1989, the same year that that wall and the East German state collapsed, Erich Honecker, the leader of the East German Democratic Republic, as it was called, as East Germany was called at the time, proclaimed that the wall, with its 55,000 landmines, its 302 watchtowers, and its 96-mile length, would stand for another 50 or 100 years. He was wrong, very wrong. Power was wrong, arrogance was wrong, and force was wrong. But how was the Berlin Wall brought down? It was not brought down by a treaty. It wasn't brought down by a war. It was brought down by a nation and a people who, when the historical opportunity presented itself, walked through the wall. But it was the wall of the ideological axioms of that state. It's sometimes possible in history for new, right, just, and needed ideas to change the course of what has otherwise seemed, even weeks earlier, to be inevitable. Now, the question that was before us today is, has the historical opportunity now once again arisen through the worldwide emergence of things like the BRICS plus nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and the additional nations now joining, the United Arab Emirates, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Ethiopia, Argentina, and others. Egypt, has the opportunity arisen for a revolutionary idea of a new security and development architecture being able to take root? And could it possibly take root by the world addressing the present war in Gaza and Israel, the war of Southwest Asia? Could that war, with its great tragedy and its great obscenity of destruction of human life, be the occasion for a reversal of these actions as a whole? Helga Zepp-LaRouche discussed that the present world tragedy recently in a meeting of the International Peace Coalition.
It is very difficult, but the situation in Gaza right now is escalating to an almost unbearable point. The latest news coming from the Chinese CGTN TV is that the IDF is bombing several hospitals in the north of Gaza, and most importantly, the Al-Shifa hospital, because they say that underneath there would be the headquarters of Hamas. Now, they also report that there are more than 60,000 people in that hospital looking for shelter. So, you can imagine what is going on there. And the Iranian foreign minister commented on this, saying that the scale of the suffering inflicted on the civilian population in Gaza means almost unavoidably a total escalation of the conflict. He told that to his Qatarian counterpart, the foreign minister of Qatar. So there is obviously the danger that this conflict can explode any moment. And, you have the military side of it. We discussed this in the previous weeks already, that, you have the 2 aircraft carriers of the United States. You have unusually announced the nuclear fueled submarine of the Ohio class, probably USS Florida, which is also cruising in the region. Obviously, all of this deployment only makes sense from the standpoint of a widening of the conflict involving Iran. And, we have said many times that if it comes to to that, then all bets are off where that will go. It could lead to a global nuclear war in the worst case. Now, there is obviously the human side of it, which I think, in many ways, I think affects every human being on the planet. And I think, Antonio Guterres, the General Secretary of the United Nations, basically said the fact that the Israelis are not differentiating between Hamas and children means that all our humanity is at stake. He says that normally all the reports coming from conflict areas, the casualties of children is normally in the hundreds. But in this case, it is in an extremely short period, thousands and thousands of children dying in Gaza. So I think what we have to do is to really make a huge effort. I mean, in some places, it is almost forbidden to mobilize for a ceasefire. Germany, Great Britain, Sweden, these are all countries who are basically trying to put a gag order on anybody who is demanding a ceasefire. But I think the situation is such that we have to absolutely escalate the international peace efforts. I could not, unfortunately, find out more about the Chinese proposal for the immediate peace conference for Southwest Asia. The Chinese have made such a proposal. There is a certain hope that maybe the meeting next week between President Biden and President Xi Jinping, which is supposed to take place in San Francisco in the context of the APEC meeting, that may lead to some agreement, but that's a week away. So I think that what we have to do is to really try to wake up the conscience of the population, that as many forces come out to try to really stop this. I mean, this will have consequences already for a very long time. There are reports by CNN who report about cables which were somehow which got into their hand from diplomats, American diplomats in the region, who were writing obviously to the State Department that this whole development already means that the United States has lost the Arab world for at least one generation. But it's not just the United States. I think it's all the countries who are condoning and being quiet without intervening will have the same fate. And unfortunately, they're sitting mostly in the so-called global north. There are many initiatives. The Pope was talking with Iranian President Raisi and many other diplomatic activities. But this is obviously not enough to stop this incredible situation going on in Gaza. So I'm appealing to all of you, try to really get more people. We have to become the absolute visible majority for this to stop. And the proposals which we have put on the table, an immediate ceasefire, an immediate Mideast peace conference as it is proposed by China and Russia. And then there must be an immediate economic development plan, the Oasis Plan, proposed by my late husband already in 1975, has to be put on the table in the context of extending the Belt and Road Initiative into Southwest Asia, so that every single country has an economic benefit of working together and establishing a durable peace. Now, let me mention one last thing, and that is that today we have the 264th birthday of Friedrich Schiller. And, he is the German poet after whom the Schiller Institute is called. And we are celebrating his birthday since the creation of the Schiller Institute every year, and also today. In many cities around the world, we are celebrating his birthday by reciting poetry, by playing great classical music, by evoking the image of man, which Schiller stands for in the most beautiful and powerful way. And I think this is very important, because when mankind is confronted with such an incredible crisis of our own humanity, where we are about to lose it if we don't act to stop this horror, then it is important that we remind ourselves of the most noble ideas which humanity has produced in the past. And, I think that what is most important right now is many people, individuals, and hopefully elected officials, but also ordinary people, to think and act on the level of the sublime, because we cannot take sides where the emotions are carrying us away. We have to absolutely work in such a way that we bring about a peace which comes from the recognition of the humanity in all human beings involved in the conflict and in the world, and act decisively. So Schiller has, given the world so many beautiful ideas, like how do you transform people from ordinary citizens who don't mind what is going on with the fate of humanity, by using classical art, by using the classical drama to elevate people, to put themselves in the shoes of the heroes on the stage of the classical drama, to think that it is them who are responsible for the fate of generations to come. And, I think there are too many people indifferent and, saying, I cannot do anything anyway. And I think to think in terms of Schiller, the image of man, that it is the task of our existence, as he puts it, to become a beautiful soul. And a beautiful soul is somebody who does what is necessary by free will, for whom duty and necessity, passion and duty are the same thing. And in the letters about Kalias, he writes that this is the case for the good Samaritan, who, when he sees somebody in need, in this case, the man by the wayside, without shelter, without clothes, and he gives his clothes and he brings him to safety into the next city, who completely does not think about himself, but only thinks about what this person needs in this moment. And I think we all need to have the hearts and the minds of good Samaritans in this moment. And that's what I want to say for the moment.
We're in the midst of many different kinds of negotiations and discussions that are ongoing concerning Israel and Gaza, including the meeting this weekend of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. There have been some discussions involving Hamas representatives in Cairo, which happened on Friday. There's Erdogan of Turkey, who's talking about perhaps denouncing the government of Israel as war criminals, and many other things that are happening. But at the same time, and probably most notably, there have been protests and demonstrations in many of the transatlantic countries and in other countries as well. And increasingly, in various ways, the voices of citizens are being heard, though in some cases also suppressed. As usual, this is different in different countries, but specifically in the nation of Great Britain, there are nefarious matters underfoot. And here to discuss that element of things is Mike Robinson from UK Column. Good to have you, Mike. And if you could, I know you've been a bit involved in watching, monitoring, and also in interviewing people involved in some of these actions. Just give us a sense of what's been happening there in the United Kingdom.
So I started to become quite concerned 3-4 weeks ago about the media coverage of the pro-Palestinian demonstrations in London. Now, we haven't seen real numbers of people out on the streets on anti-war marches since 2003, really, when there were 1 million people came out to try to suggest that Tony Blair would not bother invading Iraq. Now that didn't work. He decided to do that anyway. But nonetheless, in the intervening years, there hasn't been a significant street protest or street demonstration in terms of an anti-war demonstration. Until this, even Ukraine, although there were clearly opposition groups establishing themselves with respect to Ukraine, they weren't out on the streets in mass numbers. They were holding meetings and so on. And this is the first sort of mass demonstrations that we've seen for those years, and they're happening every Saturday. There have been 200,000-300,000 people out on the streets once or twice so far, and a lot of the rhetoric in the mainstream media, in social media, has been extremely negative towards this. So they're being labeled with the usual anti-Semitic labels, but worse than that, as we'll come on to in a second. The mainstream media headlines have been particularly concerning because it's all about fury, it's all about anger, it's all about accusing these people of being terrorists or terrorist sympathizers and so on. And so it got to the point that last week I decided it was time to go and actually see who's coming out on the streets on behalf of Palestine and speak to them. And mainly the reason for this was because tomorrow is Armistice Day. This is the day where in Britain we commemorate the end of the First World War. And then on Sunday is Remembrance Sunday, where traditionally we commemorate all the fallen in the two world wars and any other conflicts that have been going on. And because because Armistice Day happens to fall on a Saturday this year, or it's always on a Saturday, sorry, because they've been they have been protesting on a Saturday, and this happens to be Armistice Day, then this has become a really major problem. So, for example, one of the smaller news outlets had a headline, "Fury as 1 million pro-Palestine protesters set to march through London on Armistice Day." And the idea is, or the narrative that's being built is that these terrorist sympathizers are going to desecrate the Cenotaph. And the Cenotaph is the main war memorial in London. It's in Whitehall. So they are, the media and others are promoting this notion that it is at risk, that at risk is the entire culture of the United Kingdom, and people need to come out on the streets to counter this pro-Palestine demonstration. And some of the rhetoric has been horrendous. So you're happy with their anti-Semitic chants, abuse and violence is sort of the thing. Calls for violent uprising against Israel, plus anti-Semitic placards featured in central London pro-Palestine protests yet again today. Woman in Trafalgar Square with placards showing image of Star of David being thrown in a dustbin. Slogan, "Let's keep the world clean." Demonstrators allowed to take over nearby Charing Cross Station, shouting "River to the Sea," a destruction of Israel chant. Banner depicted swastika and Israeli flag with the caption, if I don't steal it, somebody else is going to steal it, Israeli proverb. So this is a type of thing that we've seen in social media. And in fact, it got worse. One right-wing commentator said UK Hamas supporters now planning a 1 million-man march on Remembrance Day. They plan to defame our war dead and desecrate the Cenotaph itself. This is the tipping point. If such a march goes ahead, then the people of Britain must come out and stop these barbarians. And this is the type of language that we've been seeing. So decided to go and meet the people that are marching. And in fact, last Saturday, there was not a march as such. They were gathering at Trafalgar Square. They had set up a stage and were having various speakers. But the fact is that everybody there was there calling for a ceasefire. The chants were not "From the river to the sea." The banners and the placards were not calling for the end of Israel. The chants were simply "Ceasefire now," and that was the chant through the whole day. And most of the banners were, saying things like "Stop the genocide." there was representation there from Jewish groups. So there was the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions was one of the Jewish groups there. Another one was Jews Against the War on Gaza. And these Jewish groups were getting absolutely positive response from the Palestinians that were there, from the and it was a cross section of the community as well. So this is the kind of rhetoric that has been building. Another one, for a few hours, Sadiq Khan's police protect the cenotaph, but it's only to avert a PR disaster. The spirit of the cenotaph is what needs to be protected, not for a few hours, but for all time. And so then Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary, decided to wade into this discussion. And just before we talk about her, in terms of the mainstream media personalities that were involved, Nigel Farage, a friend of Donald Trump, and the main man behind Brexit campaigning for the last lot of years, is absolutely the main voice on mainstream media, at least, that's pushing for a confrontation to take place tomorrow. And this, I think, is an extremely dangerous situation. So Suella Braverman, then, who is the Home Secretary, decided to wade into this. And for the last week and a half, she has been coming on to various media broadcasts explaining how the police in the United Kingdom are operationally independent, but really they need to consider stopping this this demonstration tomorrow from happening. And so at the same time that she's trying to claim that the mainstream, the police are operationally independent, she's absolutely trying to force their hand. Not only did she get involved, but Rishi Sunak got involved himself. He wrote a letter to the chief constable saying, "Dear Mark, the Remembrance Weekend is a moment of national significance. It's a weekend where the nation comes together to pay tribute to the fallen and veterans, to honor their sacrifice for our freedoms, and to resolve that those sacrifices will never be in vain. It will be especially poignant this year, as we're once again reminded of the horrors of conflict and the need to continue to defend our values. I'm deeply concerned that a number of protests are currently planned to disrupt those acts of remembrance next weekend." And he goes on to put some pressure on. He reminds the chief constable about what the legislation says. But he ends by saying, "These decisions are rightly operationally independent from politicians on the basis of full operational assessment and engagement with protest organizers and the wider community." But again, pressure for the Metropolitan Police in London to act to stop the protests from happening. Now, the truth is, there are going to be significant numbers of Palestinian demonstrators out tomorrow. How many hundreds of thousands? It's hard to say, but they are aiming for 1 million, and it's going to be it would be an impossibility for the police to stop that in any case. But in the meantime, Nigel Farage, as I say, plus some various influencers on social media, are very much organizing for there to be a counter demonstration, at least one counter demonstration, which will undoubtedly, or at least I believe, is going to end in some kind of violent acts. It's going to generate some headlines. So Tommy Robinson, who is many people say right-wing influencer on social media, has already organized for groups to appear in London tomorrow, and they're probably going to come. There won't be as many, I'm quite sure, as are on the Palestinian demonstration, but there are going to be significant numbers to run a counter demonstration, and this is going to be extremely difficult to police. Now, of course, we can see that, because it's already been set up, that should there be violence at this thing tomorrow, what will happen is that the police in London will be criticized heavily for having allowed the Palestinian demonstration to go ahead. And there will be calls for even more draconian restrictions on protest and demonstration than there are already in this country. We have talked about it on this program before, but we have had legislation pushed through in the last 18 months, which severely curtails people's right to protest in the UK, and this is undoubtedly going to be used to curtail that further. And frankly, the thought of government, direct government direction of police policy and police activity is a pretty scary proposition. They have the UK government, we've just had a King's Speech, which means that the Parliament ended, there's a new Parliament has begun, and when a new Parliament begins, the King's Speech is delivered by the King, and that lays out the legislative programme for the current Parliament. And one of the bills which is being presented is going to permit the police to enter people's property without a warrant. Now, a search warrant is a requirement for a reason, and so they are already watering down the requirement for any kind of judicial oversight in entry to people's homes. This whole narrative that's being built about which involves direct intervention by the government in the activities of the police really is the beginning of a slippery slope, I think. But the main point here is that tomorrow is likely to be a tense day in London as so many people come out in support of Palestinians, and we have counter demonstrations going on as well. Now, these counter demonstrations aren't planned to be, as far as I'm aware, flying Israeli flags or being pro-Israel. This is something slightly different in the sense that these people are coming out claiming to be defending Britain and defending Britain's legacy from the Second World War and the First World War. Because it's kind of been framed in those terms, it potentially brings in military veterans and so on. It is very much a dangerous situation. And just to sort of close on this, a lot of the narratives being presented in mainstream press, in social media, about the violence that they're claiming has been building from demonstration to demonstration over the last number of weeks, they're simply false. So when we were attending the demo on Saturday, the people that we met universally were extremely polite, extremely pleasant, extremely calm, extremely clear in what it was they wanted, which was a ceasefire. And they were absolutely willing to engage with anybody on the topic. They had they weren't trying to hide anything. They were extremely pleasant altogether. Now, so close to Trafalgar Square is a pub, a bar. And on Saturday, while the demonstration was going on, there were about 50 or 60 Royal Navy submariners in full dress uniform standing outside the Admiralty Bar at Trafalgar Square, because they had been in London for a commemoration of their own. And they were having some beer. They were certainly being there was interest in them from the crowd, but the crowd was being extremely polite. They were very pleasant, and they were all drinking together at the end of the evening. But nonetheless, as some of these Royal Navy personnel, as I say, in full dress uniform, were attempting to leave, they were having to walk through the demonstration, and at no point was there any heckling or any pushing or any barging or any strong words said. Quite the opposite. But nonetheless, the Twitter sphere was going mad about how some of these guys, as they were leaving the bar, had been assaulted. And my point here is the narratives are just untrue. And so if there is violence tomorrow, as I think there probably will be, it has been engineered, it has been generated. It's not something that is going to have happened by accident, because the propaganda and the narratives have been building for 3 or 4 weeks now to this point of Armistice Day. I think it's quite a dangerous situation, and I'm hoping that it doesn't go down the way it looks like it is going to go down. So that's really all I want to say about this at the moment, Dennis.
Thanks a lot for that report, Mike. Harley, let me go to you for a minute and just ask if there's anything that you have as a question for Mike or any commentary, also in terms of any of the other demonstrations that have been going on, particularly in Europe.
Well, Mike, you mentioned that there had been very few protests since 2003 around the Iraq War in the United Kingdom. This in spite of the role that the British have continued to play as one of the lead forces behind the Libya destruction, full support for the Maidan coup and the Ukraine war, and so on. What accounts for the change that caused people to suddenly decide they had to come out for peace and be heard?
I think that the question is what accounts for the change since between 2003 and 2023, because you know the anti-war movement has largely been, in the UK at least, has been largely driven by the left wing of politics, so the Labour Party and so on, and the Labour Party and has been so co-opted by the Blairites, of course, that up until the point when Jeremy Corbyn took over, that a lot of the organising around anti-war topics basically disappeared for a long time. But then Jeremy Corbyn became the leader of the Labour Party, and we started to see maybe perhaps some attempt to reinvigorate this a little bit. But the point was that Corbyn came under significant attack himself, and the attack that he came under was accusations of anti-Semitism because of his support for the Palestinian cause, and unfortunately he instead of standing his ground really capitulated in many ways to that, and wasn't able to find a way through that, and of course he eventually ended up losing the leadership of the party. So you know, that was really what stopped the big anti-war demonstrations in the intervening years. The Ukraine situation started to see some green shoots coming up, because and what was interesting about that was, just as in the United States, we started to see people from all sides of the political spectrum coming together on the Ukraine war. And I have to say that unfortunately that this Israel Gaza thing has split that apart again, because you know, again, the pro-Palestine demonstrations tend to be on the left, coming from the left wing of the political spectrum in the UK, and actually the people that would have come out from the sort of right wing tend to be pushing a pro-Israeli line at the moment. But I think that with the Ukraine war, we started to see people sort of reinvigorating the anti-war movement. Once Israel started bombing Gaza on the scale that they have this time, that has taken that that embryonic resurgence of anti-war feeling, and has really, you know, people have responded to what Israel's doing. And Israel is not, from a PR point of view, Israel is not doing itself any favors at the moment, quite the opposite. And what's really interesting is that a lot of the really hysterical rhetoric that's appearing in the mainstream press, I think, is a reaction to the fact that actually, although on the surface, as I say, it looks like it's mainly being, you know, organized from the left wing of politics, really this is something that people from every political persuasion are, at least amongst the general population, are just appalled by, and they're prepared to come out and express that that feeling. So I don't know whether that has answered the question, but basically it's the scale of what Israel has done here has really shocked people and brought them back out.
Mike, I have a question for you because you brought up Tony Blair, and I don't know that people here would be very aware of this, but the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change is a very active organization. Some 800 people worldwide, of massive budget in the tens of millions of dollars, very involved in the Starmer campaign and so on. And wondered what has Blair said, if anything, about the Israel-Gaza matter?
I haven't seen anything specifically from him, but we've got to remember that anything that comes out of Keir Starmer's mouth is scripted from Tony Blair. So Keir Starmer has really struggled in the last few weeks to find a narrative, a form of words which was going to work for him, because he has, as I say, because a large, by default, a large proportion of Palestinian support comes from the labor movement. He has a real problem on his hands because he's pushing the Israel has the right to defend itself narrative and the basically pushing a pro-war narrative, while many in his party, if not most, disagree with that position completely. And he's already lost, one member of his team who's resigned, and other Labour politicians have resigned because of the Labour Party's position on this. So Blair himself, I haven't seen anything out from him, but we can assume that whatever Keir Starmer says has had the seal of approval.
Okay. And Mike, we was running short on time, but I just want to reference something to you. Maybe we can have a conversation about this at another time. There was an article that appeared by a former justice of the Supreme Court, Jonathan Sumpton, called "Free Speech is Still Worth Fighting For." It's an analysis piece. I think Unheard had it on their website. And I'd like, it's an ostensible defense of freedom of speech. It's from the standpoint of John Stuart Mill and some other characters that we're not necessarily fond at here at the LaRouche organization. But I'd like to perhaps have a conversation, if we could, because you've been following this. And of course, around the demonstrations, there's obviously an attempt to suppress in various ways people's freedom of thought as well as expression. Don't know if you have any words to say to us about any of the latest developments, anything like that right now. If not, we can, of course, pick this up later. But if there's any comment as you go off, let us.
Yeah, well, Jonathan Sumption is, as you say, a former Supreme Court judge. He's been he's very capable in the sense that he understands the constitutional arrangement in the UK very well. He knows the rules of Parliament. He knows the rules of the relationship between Parliament, the judiciary, and Parliament and the police. And so he's well placed to talk on these issues. Now, since the last time I spoke to you, I've been talking about the online safety bill with you in terms of the censorship legislation on previous programs. That has now formally become an act of Parliament, and what we are beginning to see is because Ofcom, as you know, Ofcom, the regulator for broadcast media, is going to now be the regulator for the internet, and we're starting to see them begin to build the rules that they're going to operate by. So I will have much more to say on that because the thing about the online safety bill was now that it's an act, it's an enabling act, so it leaves a lot of things undefined or open to interpretation, and it's going to be a process over the next 2 years to see exactly how this is going to play out and what kind of restrictions it's going to place on freedom of speech. But it's interesting that Suella Braverman, again, who, by the way, is married to a Zionist, an open Zionist. This explains why she's taking the position that she is in saying that the Palestinian demonstrations should be stopped because these people are, effectively terrorists. is more or less what she's saying. She wrote an article for the Telegraph, I think it was, on Wednesday of this week. She was very clear at the beginning of the article that the reason that we need to ban the Palestinian demonstration on Saturday is in order to maintain freedom of speech and freedom of expression and the freedom to protest. So that is the message that she wants us to understand. We're going to maintain our freedom of speech by banning freedom of speech.
Well, good. This will be good. So we'll be able to pick this up, and in the course of picking it up next time, maybe we'll bring up George Orwell and some various of the things that he had to say about this matter. Well, thank you very much, Mike, and we'll see you next time.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Okay, great. In line with the emphasis that we're making this weekend on the birthday of Friedrich Schiller and our references also to November 9th, 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell, a kind of conversation and topic that's been ongoing, including in our Thursday fireside chat with Ray McGovern, is can movements defeat madmen? We're referring to the fact that back in 1989, when Erich Honecker, who was the leader of the East German Democratic Republic, proclaimed that the Berlin Wall was going to stay up for another 50 or 100 years in January, by November, the wall was down and Erich Honecker was in jail. And so you sometimes get points in history, apertures, in which treaties, wars are not the primary things that necessarily change history. In that case of the Berlin Wall, neither of those things was true, but rather an historical opportunity presented itself and people seemed to literally walk through the wall of the axioms of the state. We're in a situation, we believe, which is very much like that. But as you heard from Helga Zepp-LaRouche, what we've seen going on in particularly Southwest Asia is continuous escalation. And so when we're looking at the figure of Netanyahu, or we're looking at the figure of Zelensky differently in Ukraine, or for that matter, the figure of Biden, we're reminded of a characteristic of one of Schiller's villains, the governor Gessler in William Tell, is sort of stiff-necked maintenance, ideological intransigence, the inability to change one's axioms, exactly the thing that we've been polemicizing against and talking about for the last several weeks, including in our discussions about Yitzhak Rabin of Israel and what he had to say. And so what we want to do now is go to Harley Schlanger, who's been here with us for the last several weeks, describing many different things, many different aspects of the Southwest Asia circumstance, going to him for an update and also sort of an idea of how various international forces, which are now awakened, seem to be trying to address the circumstance, but what is falling short in what they're doing and what they're going to have to do if there's going to really be any kind of actual change. So Harley, good to see you as always, and you now have the floor.
All right, well, thank you, Dennis. As you mentioned, as Helga mentioned, there is the world's attention has certainly been grabbed by this, even more so than the Ukraine crisis. There are meetings, there are conferences, the OIC meeting coming up this weekend, the fact that you have the UN, various UN officials speaking out. Now, most interestingly, one of the human rights officials, Mokaiber, talked about, he resigned and talked about the impotence of the United Nations. You have a real potential. We'll see the mobilization going on, the demonstrations. So people are aware of this. They're definitely focused on the unfolding of a tragedy, a great tragedy. The idea that the Israeli, or I should say the Netanyahu regime, puts more value on a piece of real estate than on children's lives. That's now seen through social media, even through some of the media coverage, even in the United States, it's getting through. So there's a lot of talk and a lot of potential for a change. However, there's a problem. Netanyahu is not going to stop doing what he's doing. He's made it clear. he came up with this idea of maybe a 3 to 4 hour pause every day to let aid go through. Well, what happens the other 20 hours of the day? Relentless pounding, hitting hospitals, defended now by the Israelis by saying that the hospitals are used by Hamas as shields to protect their operations. Netanyahu's made clear that they're going to continue this until they completely wipe out Hamas. He's gone on to say that Israel does not have an intention of displacing people. Well, how can he say that when already more than 1 million people have been displaced? And not only that, displaced from their homes, but sent into areas where they then become targets for bombs, missiles, and now the Israel Defense Forces. So there's a complete fraud coming from Netanyahu on this, which is not surprising. People who know him, I mean, we've quoted Leah Rabin on this. She said that he's a criminal, he's a murderer, he can't be trusted. Even former Prime Minister Olmert came out and said Netanyahu's focus, while he talks about security and defense, it was under his watch that the security and defense was overcome by the Hamas attack. And he said right now Netanyahu's intent is to use the war to stay in office. And there'll be a phase 1, a phase 2, a phase 3, maybe phase infinity to keep the war going so that he can say, you have to keep me in power for security. Now, he's made it clear there will be no ceasefire, just these humanitarian pauses, which have maybe limited value, but continue with the onslaught continuing, that's the best that he's going to offer. Now, what about the United States? Well, Blinken was just on tour, and when he was confronted, whether by King Abdullah of Jordan, Mahmoud Abbas of the Palestinian Authority, everywhere he went, including the G7 foreign ministers meeting, he reasserted no ceasefire. Israel should do what it needs to do. And this is, of course, Biden's policy, or whoever it is that's running Biden's policy, which includes the people who are behind Blinken. When Biden was asked about the chances for an end to the hostilities, in other words, a ceasefire, he said, quote, none, no possibility, unquote. And then he said he is pushing for a pause in the fighting. So the blatant hypocrisy of Biden is on display, but it just adds to the sense of impotence and anger in the world. The total discrediting of institutions such as the UN, of the United States, of the European countries that are continuing to support this, that hypocrisy, which has deadly effects, is seen by everyone. So what can be done? I want to take a brief look at what happened one time before when a US president stood up and put his foot down and said, we will not support this kind of war. And that happened in 1956. The president was Dwight Eisenhower, and it occurred around the Suez Canal crisis. Now, very briefly, because it's quite complicated, but what was happening is the president of Egypt was Nasser. Nasser was a committed anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist, not just for Egypt, but had a mobilization internationally. He worked with Sukarno and Nehru to set up the non-aligned movement. And he was denouncing the French for their attacks on the Algerian liberation forces trying to decolonize Algeria. And Nasser was also at the same time trying to build up Egypt, the national economy of Egypt. And one of the projects was an upgrading of the Aswan Dam. And the United States had at one point made a pledge to provide money to help that happen. But it was pulled back, probably because of John Foster Dulles, maybe Allen Dulles, and others in the Eisenhower administration pulled back the money, said they're not going to do it. And at that point, Nasser saw no alternative but to nationalize the Suez Canal, to take it over as something that should have been in Egypt's control in any case. Now, this triggered an operation that was already planned between the French, the British, and the Israelis. That is, they were provoking a crisis as a basis for an intervention. And so what happened is that as soon as Nasser nationalized the canal, Israel launched an attack across the Sinai. They seized Gaza. They were involved in fighting right up to the edge of the Suez Canal. The British and French called for a ceasefire. Nasser said no, he wouldn't do it. He's not going to change. And then the British and the French started bombing and sent in paratroops. They were intending regime change. The policy was to get rid of Nasser. The French were particularly enraged at him because it was his meddling in Algeria, his support for the Algerian rebels. And Anthony Eden, the British Prime Minister, said that Nasser reminded him of Hitler. Sound familiar? They're always the new Hitler if they oppose the imperial forces. Now, what happened that was most interesting then is that the Egyptians sank ships in the Suez Canal to shut down the canal, which caused a big problem for the British. So the British wanted the United States to come in and join them in a war to topple Nasser, to end the nationalization of the canal, and so on. Also, at the same time, Nasser was getting support from the pro-Soviet government of Czechoslovakia and from the Soviet Union. So what happened? Eisenhower did not go along with this. Eisenhower did not want the United States to be seen as a force to supporting colonialism at a period when colonies were being toppled, when there was an anti-colonial movement throughout Africa, Asia, and so on. So Eisenhower told the British they should stop it. He went to the United Nations and got a resolution put through condemning the war and calling for it to be stopped. Of course, that didn't succeed. So then Eisenhower did what a competent president would do. He threatened the British financially. What he said is that if you continue this, we will start dumping the US holdings of British pound sterling bonds, which would create a profound financial crisis for Britain. Because if you dump the bonds, then the British are going to have to use their dollars to buy them back, or the bond market will collapse. So Eisenhower hit them in a weak spot. The fact that they were financially very weak at that point, and that the United States had the advantage. And so the British and the French decided to pull back. The Suez Crisis was stopped before it blew up into a total war, including a regime change against Nasser. And the result was that Nasser gained more prominence around the world. And the British and the French were left to lick their wounds, the Israelis to prepare for another fight in the future. Now, the reason this is important is it shows the power that the United States has if it uses it. Now, why won't Biden do that? Well, who knows what's going on in terms of his strategic capabilities for thinking. We know a lot of his advisors are part of the same people who have refused to negotiate an end to the Ukraine proxy war against Russia, even though Ukraine is practically decimated as a nation. So there's a push from that crowd to keep the war going. Keep in mind, by the way, going back to Eisenhower for a moment, that a few years later, Eisenhower presented the speech before Kennedy came in about the dangers to the Constitution and America of the military-industrial complex, the people who really wanted the United States to join the French and British and Israelis against Egypt. Eisenhower didn't do it. Biden is a complete captive of those forces that Eisenhower was warning against. And so you look at this question then, is there any chance that Biden would break with this policy? Well, we're seeing incredible pressure being put on the Biden administration from within. There are people in the State Department speaking against this. There are people in the military talking about the need to to go for a negotiated settlement in Ukraine, at least according to ABC News and NBC News. So there are some people there who are beginning to get the picture that these kinds of military confrontations don't work, that they're discrediting the United States, they're discrediting the so-called rules-based order that Biden and Blinken say that the US is defending. Now, is that enough? Can we count on these political networks to change things? Look at the Congress. The Congress, which was moving to stop the funding for Ukraine, did a complete flip, including the Trump networks, on the Israel-Gaza war, saying that we have to support it. You know, when they previously said we're not going to support wars, well, now they're in it. This was used very effectively by the pro-war faction to shift leading elements of the Republican Party away from breaking with the military-industrial complex to being, once again, a patsy in their hands. So I don't think we can count on the presidential campaign, on the congressional forces. So what can we count on? Well, this is going to require a mobilization of the American people, far bigger than anything we've seen so far. This includes marches and demonstrations, but it also includes an outreach to people who have been bamboozled by the whole narrative of the Middle East being, this is a fight, the Israelis are standing up against anti-Semitism. The anti-Semitism issue is used to silence debate. Now, interestingly, some people in the State Department, according to Politico, moved almost to touching this third rail of US politics by saying that Biden should not be afraid to criticize Israel. The US policy should include criticizing Israel when Israel is wrong, and certainly criticizing Netanyahu for the thug that he is. So the question then is, how do you change it? And this is where we can look to Schiller and the question of the Rootly Oath. There's a limit to the tyrant's power, the arrogance of people who think they can impose their will on the whole world, to go against the natural tendency of human nature of love and compassion and empathy for our neighbor. This is a central feature of the great religions. Now, can we mobilize people around that sense of the brotherhood of man, of the fact that thou shalt not kill, that vengeance does not belong in the hands of a Netanyahu? Netanyahu may think, you know, the saying, vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. Netanyahu may actually, in his fantasy state, see himself as the prophet of the Lord. I've got news for him. He's not. But this is where the people have to be heard. Now, one time this happened in the recent period was when Obama was planning to get an authorization to use military force against Syria over the hoped up story of Syria and the Assad government using chemical weapons against their own people. And of course, this was a British intelligence operation. The so-called white helmets and the attempt to claim that this was the case, and Obama was going to go with it. But what happened before he went to the Congress is there was a flood of calls into the Congress of people saying, we won't support this war. And Obama backed down from it, backed off it. Now, they still continued through covert operations to support the terrorists against the Assad government. But they couldn't do it with an official authorization as they had after 9/11. Now, one thing that we've been told repeatedly is that congressional offices, if they start getting a lot of calls, a lot of letters, they do feel the need to respond. And I think now, because we're in the midst of a presidential campaign, it's completely wide open. Whatever anyone tells you about it, forget about it. The results of the Tuesday elections show that, you know, the Democrats, who were thought to be on their last legs, ended up winning. There are doubts now in the MAGA world. Will Trump be able to survive and under the effect of these legal attacks against him. So don't assume anything, except there is a limit to the tyrant's power. And that means that we, the people, have an obligation and a duty, a moral responsibility to speak up for those children, whether they're Palestinian or Israeli, who are the victims of these wars, the children of Yemen, the children of Afghanistan, the children around the world whose lives have been taken because of this imperial neo-colonial policy. We have a responsibility to speak up and to sing, to inspire people to the higher powers of our human nature. And I think that's what we saw, ironically, in the case of Dwight Eisenhower. And I think it's not inconsequential that Eisenhower was the one who raised this problem of the military-industrial complex. So that's my report for today, Dennis.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Harley. And what we're going to do on the questions this time is something a little bit different. I have one thing which I want to ask you to comment on, and then I think Jose's got a few questions that he'll just directly pose to you. These are a combination of things that came up on Thursday evening when we were having a discussion with Ray McGovern about Southwest Asia and so on, and they weren't fully answered. But you talked about Eisenhower quite a bit, and of course, Eisenhower becoming famous because of the military-industrial complex speech, and of course, Suez, as you just talked about it. But then again, of course, there's Kennedy.
Yeah.
We're only a few days away now, from 11 days away from the 60th anniversary of the assassination of JFK. Clearly, JFK found himself in direct battle with the military-industrial complex. In fact, talked about shattering the CIA into 1,000 pieces, and made a very bold proposal on September 20th at the United Nations in 1963, talking about a joint space collaboration between himself and the Russians, a joint mission to the moon. So how would you characterize, let's say, what happened both with respect to the presidency of Kennedy, but also the aftermath of the presidency of Kennedy in that regard?
Well, the last few weeks, we've been talking a lot about the courage of Yitzhak Rabin and Arafat on this principle of changing axioms. You know, the two of them had been fighting their whole lives to defend what they believed was the interests of their people. In the case of Rabin, he was a pretty tough commander in war, was unwilling to concede that there could be a Palestinian state, even though that was the official policy of Israel. And Arafat, of course, was with the Palestine Liberation Organization, was involved in terrorism, not just against Israel, but around the world. But what happened is they changed their axioms. Now, that was in 1993 when it came to fruition with the Oslo Accord. Well, 30 years earlier, John Kennedy gave us a beautiful example of a change in axioms. And it took Kennedy the experience of nearly bringing the world to a nuclear war over the Cuban Missile Crisis. But he came out of it as a completely different figure of an American president, except he reflected the tradition of Franklin Roosevelt, and I would argue also of what Eisenhower had presented. And what Kennedy basically said is that instead of going to war with the Soviets, let's look at the world from their perspective and see what security interests they have that correspond to our security interests. And that's what he said in his June 10th, 1963 speech, that while we may abhor communism, we honor the Soviet Union for its great accomplishments and recognize that in the final analysis, we are all human and we all desire the same things for ourselves and our children. It's a beautiful speech and people should go back to that. So that was a moment when Kennedy stood up and directly challenged the axioms of the American people. Again, this was leading up to the 1964 presidential campaign, where he knew he was going to be a target of the war hawks of that time. So he showed the courage to do what later Rabin and Arafat did in reaching across to an enemy and say, look, we can make peace. Let's find the common interests. That's why diplomacy and negotiation are so important. And when Biden and Zelensky and Netanyahu say no negotiations, no ceasefires, no diplomatic settlement, they're going against the interests of every single person on this planet. So that's, to me, the importance of the presidency of John Kennedy.
Okay, Harley, I have the next question here for you,
Okay.
which is, what do you think the possibility of Biden not being the Democratic presidential candidate in 2024 is, given that he's a captive of the military-industrial complex?
Well, a lot can happen, but I want to point out we're just a little bit more than 2 months from the official opening of the presidential campaign with the Iowa caucuses. And if you look at the polls that are coming out, you see that Biden is trailing Trump in a number of the key battleground states, 5 of the 6 key battleground states that Biden won in 2020. He's behind, in some cases by substantial margins, 4 to 11%. At the same time, while the Democrats are talking up the economy, the polls show that almost 3/4 of American people don't think we're going in the right direction. That a growing number of people can barely afford to pay for housing, food, and medical care. And so this idea that the economy is booming, that everything's going great, well, if you own a defense stocks of a defense corporation or big pharma or the major banks, maybe you think things are okay. But if you have to work for a living and produce something for a living, you don't believe that. And so we're seeing an irony here, because the elections that took place last Tuesday in Virginia and Kentucky and a couple in Ohio seemed to be going the Democrats' way. But that was without Biden being the person who was involved. It was the abortion issue, a popular Democrat in Kentucky, and a maybe not so popular Republican governor of Virginia. So what does that mean? Well, the Democrats are going to have to face the fact that Biden is presiding over 2 wars that by November 2024 will be highly unpopular, that we will have spent hundreds of billions of dollars to defeat Russia in Ukraine, which is not going to work. And yet we've been told over and over and over that we have a good strategy, we're supporting democracy, and we're preventing the takeover of Europe by Putin. Well, Biden is going to be discredited there. And I think the tide is turning against support for the war in Gaza. So what do the Democrats do? Well, who do they turn to? You know, they had a choice of Robert F. Kennedy Jr., but they iced him out. They have a couple of other people who are talking about it. Joe Manchin is now talking about possibly deciding to run. I think the main thing, Jose, is that the situation is going to be highly chaotic, and it's going to be shaped by events outside the United States, along with the continuing devolution of the US economy. So the question is, who has a program? Who has a solution? And I would argue that what people should do is immediately start working with the LaRouche organization. We have one campaign, the Diane Sare campaign for Senate, which does represent a significant policy alternative. And we have to get other people who are running for Congress, running for state legislatures, running for governor's offices. We have to inject in those campaigns reality. And that reality is no to these war hawks and no to the neoliberals on economics. And we have an excellent record on those things because of the work over decades of Lyndon LaRouche. So, you know, I would say to Democrats, don't despair over Biden. Let's find a whole new set of new candidates. And for those people who are saying they don't like Biden because of his age, fine, let's get younger people who are not so set in their ways or so controlled. And we're seeing, I think, a bit of life in the younger generation, which sees otherwise a dead end for their lives if we continue in this direction.
Okay, Harley, here's another question for you. Eisenhower took action against Britain by threatening to dump the pound. Can the Chinese do the same thing with respect to the United States, or will they try to approach Biden in the upcoming meeting in a completely different way? Could they propose a redevelopment of Gaza, a rebuilding of Gaza in the context of a two-state solution?
Well, that's a very interesting question, because the difference between Britain in 1956 and the United States today is that while some people in Britain still thought they were the global superpower and thought that with backing of the United States, they could still control the global economy and trade and so on, they were already on a very sharp downward track, which has just continued in an accelerating fashion, so that the situation in the United Kingdom today is increasingly desperate for most people. The United States, in spite of the problems I just mentioned, still is a powerful military force and still has a certain capability in terms of an economy, even though it's been significantly degraded over the last 30 years with NAFTA, with deindustrialization and so on. It still represents a potential. And the dollar still plays a role in international finance and trade. The problem is the dollar has been weaponized against the global south and against the BRICS countries. And the US is supporting these wars to destabilize those countries, at the same time to divert the attention of the American people from the collapse of their own standard of living. Now, what you're proposing, or the questioner is proposing, is very interesting, because the Chinese have already offered to the United States to become a participant in the Belt and Road Initiative. You remember, it was Obama who had this Pacific Partnership Plan, which would have excluded China. Trump talked to Xi Jinping. He expressed some interest in these policies, but then through people like Pompeo and Bolton and others, was pulled back away from it. The question of whether Biden can be moved by Xi Jinping, they're going to meet in San Francisco next weekend, I think. The question is really, will the Chinese make an offer that Biden can't refuse? And that would be an offer to mediate or to work with the United States for an end of the fighting in Ukraine, an end of the fighting in the Southwest Asia arena, and to bring the United States in as a partner in the global development policies that are associated with the Belt and Road Initiative. If the United States doesn't do that, we're going to see the continued move toward de-dollarization, in which case the United States may find itself in the not too distant future in the same condition as the United Kingdom in 1956. That is, with a collapsing currency, a collapsing economy, and no credibility in the world. So it would behoove Biden or whoever speaks for him and controls him to accept an offer if the Chinese make one.
Okay, this is the last question here for you, Harley. This is from last night's discussion, or from Thursday night's discussion. What does a one-state solution entail? What does a two-state solution entail? One commentator last night insisted that only a one-state solution would work. Russia and China, among others, have called for a two-state solution. What's the story?
Well, there's a long history to the two-state solution that goes back to the British Mandate and the Peel Commission in 1937, which sort of sidestepped the question by saying there should be a Jewish state and a Palestinian state. And the United Nations has, from 1948 on, insisted that the two-state solution, and this is international agreement, the two-state solution, in other words, that there will be a state of Israel and a separate Palestinian state. The problem is that with the increase in settlements going on in the former Palestinian area and the dispossession of Palestinians, the, in a sense, ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in whole areas of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and it was going on in Gaza. And it apparently, this is Netanyahu's goal in Gaza, is to lessen the Palestinian presence there. That in a sense, Netanyahu's going for a one-state solution in which the Palestinians are so reduced to the idea of being second or third-class citizens with no vote and no say, that Israel will remain a one-state power. Now, the argument that comes up is that if you have one state and the Palestinian population grows, then the idea of Israel as a Jewish state becomes threatened, or it would cease being a democracy, in which case the whole argument that Israel's the democracy in the region is lost. So there's a paradox for the one-state solution, which is not there in the two-state solution. The problem with the two-state solution is that the Israeli leadership, and particularly the greater Israel fanatics, the followers of Vladimir Jabotinsky, which included Begin, Shamir, and now Netanyahu, they don't want a Palestinian state. And what Sharon used to say is, we have facts on the ground. If you have Jewish settlements in all these areas of what's supposed to be Palestine, who could argue for a Palestinian state? And this is what feeds into people who are saying that Israel is an apartheid state, because they're keeping the Palestinians with no say in their own future and no power within the areas where they live. So the only resolution here is what Lyndon LaRouche put forward with his Oasis Plan, which is cooperation for mutually beneficial economic development of a Palestinian state and an Israeli state. And that while Israel has a lot of technological advantages and certainly a lot of financial advantages, monetary advantages, the question of a Palestinian state which could stand on its own will depend on developing the industrial and agricultural base of a Palestinian state. That was the idea behind Oslo, which picked up on the proposals of LaRouche from the late 80s, early 90s of the Oasis Plan. So the only way a two-state solution works would be with a buildup of the Palestinian areas with this kind of economic development perspective. Now, would that be bad for Israel? Of course not. This would be to the benefit of every person living in Israel, not just for peace and security, but for economic growth. So the only way a two-state solution really will function is to take the ideas of LaRouche's Oasis Plan and implement them. And one of the best ways to do that, besides the bilateral talks between Israel and the Palestinians, would be to have the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative to be incorporated into that, but also to have a shift in the European Union and a shift in the US policy to support such an outcome.
In our next segment, we're going to talk to Professor Cliff Kiracofe, who has been thinking about the broader implications, the broader strategic implications of what people are looking at as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, better referred to as the Southwest Asia conflict, better looked at actually in terms of the historical implications for the change in the character of the United States itself, as the United States confronts the fact that the earlier rules-based order conceptions, the conceptions about exporting democracy, and the various other notions about humanitarian intervention, the Tony Blair advanced responsibility to protect, going back to 1999 and the issue of Serbia, all of these doctrines have suddenly evaporated in the face of the obvious contradiction of American policy manifest in the destruction of Palestine. a destruction which is ongoing, is public, is of the nature of a depopulation, and yet continues relentlessly. In fact, it escalates day by day, so that although there are demonstrations and although there are statements, although there are conferences, although there are consultations, the killing not only continues, but the killing continues in such a way as to multiply the number of, quote, terrorists, that is to say, oppositions to the Israeli policy, so that the character of what is being done can't be being done for the reasons given. It's occurred too many times in the past. And in fact, it's occurred many times in the past in that precise area of the world. It's why Yitzhak Rabin, the former defense minister, then the prime minister of Israel, changed his path and made the point that you can't, in fact, ensure security with bombs or with soldiers or with tanks or with weapons, but you have to do that by creating hope, creating an economy that works, creating the basis of cooperation among people. So we're glad to have Cliff with us. Cliff was very active with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee before, and he has been a longtime collaborator, discussant with various of us here on this platform. So Cliff, we're glad to have you here. And so I'm going to let you just give your view of how you see this debacle going on in Southwest Asia in the broader strategic context.
Thanks, Dennis, for inviting me to our discussion today. And thanks to all the viewers for listening in and watching. First of all, I think the global context is one where we have a power transition in the world, moving toward a multipolar world rather than a single hegemonic domination of the planet by the United States and its British and other NATO allies. So within this power transition, China and Asia are rising. Russia is returning to its former powerful self. Africa and Latin America are more active now internationally, have more weight in international matters. And we're faced now within this transition period, apparent lashing out by the United States to attempt to maintain its imperial domination, its hegemonism. So within that global context of a changing power relations in the world, we now have the spectacle, which is a complete tragedy, of the genocide in Gaza, and also increasingly the Israelis are attacking the West Bank as well. All of that area, of course, is Palestine. Gaza has been occupied. The 1967 war, where Israel attacked Egypt, the 1967 war resulted in the Israelis occupying the West Bank and Gaza. In 2005, supposedly, what Sharon did is move some of the physical occupation forces out of Gaza, but created an encirclement of that small space that has over 2 million people living in it, an encirclement by the sea, by land, etc. So it's like a large outdoor concentration camp is really what the Israelis created. If we look, why are those people there? Well, they are refugees from Israelis' 1948, what is called the Nakba, or the catastrophe, which was the Israeli expulsion of Palestinians from their land and their homes and their farms and their businesses, creating a large number of refugees that were then settled in various camps. Outside of of the area as well in Lebanon. So Gaza has been an issue for 5-6 decades now. The current situation is one where we have massive bombardments of civilian structures and destruction of thousands of buildings and housing. We have maybe 40,000 injured. We have maybe 8, 9, 10,000 dead Palestinians because of the bombardment, the aerial bombardment that's going on, which includes white phosphorus and other illegal materials. This particular situation was triggered. It began October 7, October 8, but several weeks prior to that, the fundamentalist Israeli group that wants to tear down Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is the third holiest place in Islam. It would be like trying to tear down the Vatican or something. They want to tear down Al-Aqsa Mosque and build up the third temple, so-called. This is an extremist cult, but they're influential. And they had entered the mosque and defaced it, etc., for several weeks prior and also in the past to this incident, to the initial Hamas response to that. That's why this operation by Hamas is called the Al-Aqsa Flood. This means it's focused on, at the religious level, defending their holy site, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and also linking it to resistance to the Israeli occupation. Under international law, the occupying power is supposed to treat the people that it's occupying with some level of decency. That's under international law. The occupying power has responsibilities to protect those that they're occupying. The second legal issue is the legal issue of the right of resistance. Hamas is a resistance organization. It is resisting occupation. You could compare that, for example, to the French resistance in World War II to the Nazi occupation of France. The French were justified, and the resistance movement had every right legally to resist the Nazi occupation. So what we're talking about here then is a couple of major points in international law that are being a bit not appearing sharply, let's say, in the major media, and people may be getting confused or misled on these two issues. So Hamas does have a legal right. The Palestinian people have a legal right to resist and to create resistance organizations. So what is going on now is, according to some legal experts and UN personnel, etc., it constitutes the level of violence, death, and destruction constitutes or falls under a definition of genocide, a technical legal definition of genocide. So that's what the whole world is watching right now. I've been monitoring a number of social media sites, and particularly X or Twitter, where you have imagery, real-time imagery of the Israelis bombing mosques, bombing Christian churches, bombing apartment buildings, bombing hospitals, destroying bakeries, food sources, water sources, etc. So this is all documented real-time live by video and also by photographers, press photographers. So there's no secret around the world, particularly in the Arab and Muslim world, where this imagery is broadcast 24/7 right now. And that brings me to a point about U.S. policy. this particular policy of backing Israeli genocide is creating throughout the world, and I mean not just the Arab world in the Middle East or Southwest Asia, not just there, but all the way out to Malaysia and to Indonesia and all around the world, in the Islamic world, and in the developing world, global South, we can say. So this is creating a boiling of public opinion against the United States. This isn't going to go away. This is going to be remembered for a generation. This is going to impact negatively American foreign policy for a generation. It's or more even. This is so outrageous that the world will not ignore it, nor will the world forget it. That means that our own national security is jeopardized in the long run. Our commercial relations and other sorts of relations are jeopardized by this U.S. policy. I think I want to make a frank statement here that our national leadership is at one of the poorest levels that I can remember in my lifetime. And we're in a constitutional crisis at home. We've got a border crisis in the southern border. Now we have a war in Ukraine. We just lost, supposedly, the war in Afghanistan and Iraq, which cost us $8 trillion. So the United States for the last 20 years or so has had, awful leadership and heading us into, at a very fast pace, into a brick wall, which we may encounter here in Gaza, or the related ripple effect from this crisis. Tomorrow, Saturday, we will have a formal speech by Mr. Nasrallah, who is the leader of Hezbollah. Also, there's a large meeting of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation in Riyadh about the Gaza crisis, this particular crisis. Blinken and Sullivan, as advisors to the president, are, patently incompetent. I do want to mention that there's an element of personal element here that should never appear in American foreign policy. I mean, we're 340 million people from all different walks of life, all different races, religions, etc. But Blinken's grandfather was a major supporter of Zionism after World War II in the United States, a major lobbyist for Zionism in the United States. And curiously, they were from Kiev in the Ukraine. And President Biden seems somewhat unhinged here with personal feelings. He once said, if Zionism didn't exist, we'd have to invent it, or something along those lines. If Israel didn't exist, we'd have to invent it. So these are very personal and emotional matters that should not be involved in foreign policy of the United States, our national security policy. I would just say that I would recommend people to try to get onto X or Twitter and just take a look at some of the imagery, take a look at some of the news reporting by non-US news sources, Arab news sources and others, and see this bloody devastation. It's completely horrifying. It's like looking at a horror movie, really. Now, whether it will terminate soon or not is an open question. The main question right now is, will this escalate much further, or can it be contained, and can we get a ceasefire? I mean, the ceasefire would be the optimum thing. That would be the best we could hope for, is a ceasefire as soon as possible. On the other hand, the Israelis are intensifying their attack on Gaza, intensifying their airstrikes and more and more troops and armor, etc. So the direction of the Israeli side so far is an escalation. At the same time, the resistance movement side is meeting that escalation, and they are ramping up as well. That's why Hezbollah in Lebanon has opened a front along the Lebanese-Israeli border. Hezbollah was a resistance movement, but it's not, they're more of a defensive, or have been more of a defensive movement to protect southern Lebanon rather than to invade some place. But they are conducting operations along the border, which has caused the Israelis to move a considerable amount of forces to that northern border, which may or may not take some pressure off of the Gaza front. But the key thing to remember now is the resistance movement is not just inside Gaza or in southern Lebanon. It also exists in Yemen, it exists in Iraq, and also, of course, Iran. So the overall different various groups that are concerned about the Palestine question, this overall resistance movement, a regional movement, is escalating itself or trying to meet the Israeli escalation by step, so that the dynamic right now is one of further escalation and not ceasefire. So it's going to be important for us the next 48 hours or so to see what happens tomorrow in the speeches and the activity at the Islamic Organization Conference. That's just a quick overview. We can go into some details, Dennis, if you want.
Yeah, I had a couple of questions for you, Cliff. And I don't
Sure.
know if you have heard the statements that were made by former Israeli Prime Minister Olmert. And he was commenting on Netanyahu. Let me see if I can actually bring this up. Just give me a minute here. These would have been, I believe, 2 days ago. And okay, he used the word which we won't use here, but he had the following to say: Netanyahu has shrunk. He's destroyed emotionally. Bibi has been working all his life on the false pretense that he is Mr. Security. He's Mr. BS. He used a different word, Mr. BS. Every minute he is prime minister, he is a danger to Israel. I seriously mean it. I am certain the Americans understand he's in bad shape. Now, he went on to say, responding to a question as to whether or not the occupation of Gaza was something that Israel would do for security reasons. He said, Olmert said, it's not in Israel's interests to oversee the security of Gaza. It is in our interest to be able to defend ourselves in a different way than we did before the October 7th attack. But to control Gaza again, no. He said, there's a total lack of planning for the next phase. Does anybody think about it? We need to present to the international community our idea of an endgame. If Israel produced a serious proposal for two-state negotiations, it would have a dramatic impact on the international community. And now let me just say, this is me talking. He is not a peacenik. He's just a person that's talking about destroying Hamas. He goes on to say it would give us more space and time to achieve the aims of our military operations, but it would show that Israel is committed to doing something it hasn't wanted to do in the past 15 years. We're not doing this. No one wants to think about it. No one wants to spell it out. Nobody wants to say it. And he said about Netanyahu, finally, his focus seems to be stopping being thrown out of office the day the war stops, and even maybe before then. You expect him now to be talking about the second phase and the third phase. He's not certain he will survive politically this phase. So those were the remarks. Your comment.
Well, first of all, we have to separate in Israeli politics the fact that Netanyahu is very, very unpopular, and there have been massive demonstrations in Israel against his policies, reforming the Supreme Court and other sorts of domestic internal policies. However, the polling data that I've been made aware of about the overall Israeli attitude toward the military activity against Gaza, that's at about 80% approval. So we have to separate out Netanyahu's lack of approval for the general Israeli public's strong approval of the current genocide in Gaza. So that's a distinction that needs to be made. Bibi, Bibi is well known to the American Congress, et cetera, et cetera. He's appeared there. He has friends in Congress and all of this sort of thing for many, many years. So Bibi knows very well how to manipulate Washington, D.C., the politicians and that sort of thing. He's very skillful that way. And that combines with the Christian Zionist lobby and the pro-Israel lobby and AIPAC and all of that. So Bibi is very, very skillful in manipulating politics and political opinion inside what we call the Beltway in Washington. I met with Bibi many years ago in Israel, in his office for a discussion, exchange of views. And I visited, of course, Israel, and I enjoyed my visit there, most of it. But remember that the ideology, the political ideology here, what are we talking about? We're talking about political Zionism. And political Zionism has nothing to do with Judaism, which is the religion. No. Political Zionism was a movement started in the late 19th century. And in 1897, in Basel, Switzerland, the international Zionist movement came together and created a plan that they would like to have their own country. So that's political Zionism, the idea of having a country and in a specific geographical space. So what we're talking about here is political Zionism. Now, the Bibi version of that and the right-wing version of that in Israel is called revisionist Zionism. That ideology was created by a fellow by the name of Vladimir Jabotinsky. And he was an advocate of a very, very hard line and the use of maximum force, military, to achieve the political goal of the creation of the State of Israel. And Jabotinsky's foundational beliefs, he was an admirer of Mussolini, and he was an admirer of Nietzsche. So if we take a look at Bibi today, and remember that Bibi's father was Jabotinsky's private secretary, now we can see inside Bibi's mind Nietzschean thought and Mussolini-style fascist activity. Now, I do want to make a point that Bibi is being very sharp at how to manipulate Congress. He very well knows about the Christian Zionist lobby in Washington and across the United States. Maybe 25 million believers in this Christian Zionist heresy. But that's a lot of people, and there's a number of people in Congress that espouse this. As a matter of fact, the new Speaker of the House of Representatives stated that, quote, as Christians, we should support Israel. Well, just a minute here. We're a republic. We have many different religions here in our country, including people who choose not to believe in a religion, or people who have other types of ideologies. So, but that's an indication of the level of penetration of this fundamentalist heresy in Washington, and it has a political implication because they're the ones voting for all the weapons to go to Israel. They're the ones that are backing the Israeli genocide in Gaza. And I would point out on the Senate side, there was a 97-0 vote supporting the Israeli genocide in Gaza, 97-0. 3, I imagine, were necessarily absent. But that's basically the entire Senate of the United States. So looking at the House of Representatives and the Senate, lockstep with Bibi. And this revisionist Zionism, which translates out to the idea that you have to exclude or remove or expel Palestinians, Palestinian Arabs, whether they are Muslim or Christian, and there are a number of Christian Palestinians, of course. This political Zionism wants to physically expel them outside of the geographical boundary that the Zionists have imagined for this Israel or a greater Israel. That means transferring, which is a polite term, you could say expelling or whatever, Palestinians into Jordan, which is a neighboring country, and the idea that Jordan is Palestine. That's an old slogan of these people. Well, you know, let's just throw them out of Israel and they can go live in Jordan. There's a lot of Palestinians in Jordan anyways, and so Jordan can be Palestine and we'll have Israel over here. And the same approach to the folks in Gaza. We can expel them, transfer them over to Egypt, and they can just go, because Egypt borders Gaza, of course. They can just go across the border there and go into Egypt and leave Gaza. So that's the policy of transfer, which is the polite term, but it's a genocidal policy, of course, under international legal definitions and also under the Geneva Conventions, Fourth Geneva Convention and things along those lines. So we have to get into the mind of Bibi. Now, don't forget, not 2 weeks ago or maybe more, he made a speech in which he made a biblical reference. He talked about the Arabs as Amalek. We have to destroy Amalek, like in the Old Testament story. That's the idea. He likes to use the Old Testament mythology. At any rate, Bibi publicly stated that that this is like clearing out Amalek. It's getting rid of the Arab in the Old Testament, in the Bible. Why did he say that? It sounds really weird for a politician in the year 2023 to be talking about Amalek. I mean, this is a rather bizarre thing. No, Bibi knows Washington very well, and he knows the Christian Zionist fundamentalists very well. So this is a coded form of speech. He's not talking to the Israelis about this or the European. No, this phraseology was directed to his supporters in the United States in the various cultic denominations of Christian Zionism and in Congress. So Dennis, if you're talking about the mind of Bibi, yes, there is some strangeness in that mind and psychosis for sure, but we have to remember the ideological roots. Nietzsche, Mussolini, Jabotinsky, Bibi's dad, Jabotinsky's secretary, Bibi, leader of the revisionist Zionist ideology. So it's a mix. It's a mix there. There's a clear ideology, and also there's his own personal psychology problems and his legal problems.
Okay, Cliff, we're going to be up on time, but I have a very particular question I wanted to ask you, because you were a congressional staffer for many years. So you're familiar with the workings of the Congress. You referenced a minute ago the question of Christian Zionism, but also more broadly, just the functioning of the Congress. As you know, recently, one congressperson, Congresswoman Tlaib, was censured by that body. She's the only Palestinian that is in that body, but of course, when she spoke in her own defense, she was quite moved is the best way to put it, not merely quite emotional, but quite moved, because her point was that she didn't realize that she would have to say this, but that Palestinians, like all other people in the world, have to be thought about as being equal to all other people in the world. And you can't talk about killing people or filling up hospitals and bombing hospitals as though they are collateral damage. So having served, worked with congresspersons over many decades, actually, what's your view of what this all means? Compare for us also the function of the Congress now to, let's say, 30 years ago, and what would the American people need to do to address what seems to be an horrific dysfunction?
Well, first of all, I worked in the Senate for 11 years, and I served on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And actually, I've also written a book that touches this issue called Dark Crusade, Christian Zionism and U.S. Foreign Policy, published in 2009. You can find it on Amazon. What is shocking about the vote in the House of Representatives to censor Representative Tlaib is really an appalling affront to the freedom of speech and debate on the floor of the House as well as the floor of the Senate. There is freedom of speech and debate. People with different views clash all the time. How is it? And a vote of censure is very rare, very rare. Usually it might be for a financial situation or criminal activity of some, who knows, but it's very rare. And for the Congress, the House, to censure a seated member of the House for speaking out in debate is really, personally, in my view, it's a movement towards that we're seeing all over the country and in Washington, a movement towards a type of American fascism, really. And so I think that trying to silence this Congresswoman, and I may not agree with all of her views, and none of us may agree with any of her views, but the point is that she has a right as a congressperson, elected representative of her district in Michigan. She has the right to speak out freely and without fear or censorship in the House. So for me, that was a very, very significant and indication of the degree of disintegration of the quality of our leadership in Congress over the last decades, let's say, several decades. But in recent years, it's even more pronounced. You have McConnell on the one side and Schumer in the Senate. You have very superficial discussions of foreign policy and emotions generated against Russia, sort of and all these are, to me, they're kind of racist, against Russia. Well, that's against the Slavic people who are Orthodox in their religion. Against China, oh, well, that's racist against the Oriental people, the Chinese people. Against Congresswoman Tlaib, oh, she's Palestinian. Oh, that means she's an Arab, blah, blah, blah. So there's this increasing racism, actually, in Washington, in the Congress. And how can a country, we're 340 million people, how can a republic with 340 million people go forward through space and time on this planet with racist attitudes like that and complete belligerence in the world? Our country's essentially been militarized. We don't do diplomacy anymore. We just drop bombs or help people drop bombs like the Israelis. So I think in response to your question, Dennis, definitely the American people must wake up and see the situation that's right in front of their eyes. The incompetence of Congress. We spent $8 trillion on Afghanistan and Iraq wars, and I don't know how many 100 billion, 200-300 billion on Ukraine, and who knows how many 100 billion now on the Gaza war. What about what about poverty in the United States? What about homelessness? What about drug addiction? What about our crumbling infrastructure? What about our educational system? I mean, our country internally is falling to pieces and becoming polarized. I mean, you know, one group of Americans doesn't like another group of Americans, and you know, this sort of thing. Well, we're all citizens of a republic. We all have one vote. I mean, you know, no matter what our ethnicity is, or religion, or orientation, social, let's say, orientations. So I'm very concerned, Dennis, and I think raising that point about Congresswoman Tlaib is very, very important, and it's kind of a symbol of how far gone we've gotten. And I think we need to think more carefully about, you know, toleration and maintaining our constitutional system, and freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and so on. So that's a short answer to your question.
Okay, well, very good. Thank you very much, Cliff. So we've just heard from Professor Cliff Kiracofe, president of the Washington Institute for Peace and Development, a congressional staffer for many years, and also, as he said, an author. Cliff, what was the name of the book again that you said you had written in 2009?
No, it's my 2009 book. It's called Dark Crusade, Christian Zionism and U.S. Foreign Policy. And it obviously focuses on the Middle East, Israel, and also at the time I began writing it, we were just starting the Iraq War, which I, of course, was opposed to. So it's called Dark Crusade, Christian Zionism and U.S. Foreign Policy. And my publisher is in London, and the publisher is Bloomsbury Books, and it's the IB Taurus division of Bloomsbury Books in London. And my book is available on Amazon and Barnes and Noble, and 20 paperback, like $20, $25, $28, something along those lines. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks.
I hope people will read it.
Very good, Cliff. Very good. So we opened today's program by referencing that we're recording on November 10th, the birthday of Friedrich Schiller, and we're going to conclude today by presenting to you a biography of Friedrich Schiller prepared by the Schiller Institute.
Only a great subject is able to deeply arouse our humanity. While the mind is limited when it moves in small circles, man rises to meet his higher purpose. And now, at the grave end of the century, when reality itself becomes poetry, when we see the combat of powerful natures, and battles are waged for the sake of mankind, for dominion and for freedom, now may art attempt, upon her stage of silhouettes, to soar yet higher. Aye, she must, should the stage of life not disgrace her.
What would Schiller say were he to see us today? The great cause of mankind seems more weighty. The world peace and freedom are at stake. The less favored part of the world is threatened with extinction for lack of development. Rabid Jacobinism is raging in the southeast regions of the world. It appears our entire civilization is in danger. Would Schiller today pass the same judgment he reached upon witnessing the Jacobin terror of the French Revolution, that a great moment has found a little people? It is in order to provide a more fortunate answer to this question that the International Schiller Institute has been founded. Its members in many nations share a fundamental belief in the reason of man, and thus the belief that even the greatest of crises can be solved. No one more perfectly embodied the humanist ideal of humanity. No one more effectively united the conception of Republican freedom with the principle of poetic beauty than he. What Beethoven was for music, that is what Schiller meant for poetry. Schiller and Beethoven were the giants of the German classics, infinitely like one another in their method of thought, each having established the standards by which all art must henceforth be measured. Schiller was the great Republican poet of freedom who knew to adorn the ideal of a nobler, more beautiful mankind in such powerful language that he truly found an infallible key to the most secret accesses of the human soul. One eyewitness wrote about the premiere performance of The Maid of Orleans in Leipzig.
The entire square in front of the theater was choked with people. Then he stepped out. Voices ordered the hats removed. Then the poet walked through the crowd of his admirers, their heads bared, and they shouted, "There he is!"
Schiller exerted the most powerful influence on all positive developments in German history. The Prussian reformers von Stein and von Humboldt Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, and many others were decisively formed by him. He was the mind that spurred them on in the wars of liberation. And yet, he also influenced the best minds worldwide, like John Quincy Adams, Edgar Allan Poe, James Fenimore Cooper, just to name a few. One must bring to mind the electrifying effect of a genius upon his fellow men in order to understand Schiller's effect upon history. Thus, the great humanist and creator of the best model of education, Wilhelm von Humboldt, who lived in Schiller's company for many years and was, with Goethe, one of the pillars of the Weimar classical period, writes about Schiller that there was none in that era more deserving of the examination of his internal intellectual life.
A great intellect can have no more direct and comprehensive effect than through his own works. These works, however, illuminate merely one part of his essential nature, which only flows back clearly and fully in living form, in a manner which can neither be proven in the individual case nor followed by thought alone. This is assimilated by his contemporaries and bequeathed to future generations. This quiet and almost magical effect of great minds is the principal vehicle by which an ever-expanding body of thought can extend ever more broadly and powerfully from one generation, one nation to the next.
Never did Germany come closer to Schiller's ideals than during the Liberation Wars, which were by no means merely a patriotic uprising against Napoleon's tyranny. Rather, they were simultaneously an enthusiastic Republican constitutional movement, spurred onward by no one so much as the great poet of freedom, Friedrich Schiller. Thus, the Prussian reformers used Schiller's history of the 30 Years' War in their battles against Napoleon. Gneisenau rehearsed Wallenstein's camp with his soldiers. Countless soldiers visited Schiller's widow to receive lines from his poem and kept them near their hearts to march, thus strengthened, into battle. When Schiller's writings were banned under the Carlsbad Decree of the reactionary rulers of the Holy Alliance in 1819, they were passed from hand to hand, and his popularity grew even more. He became the inspiration and hero of youth. His fame spread around the world, and in 1836, Germans from all over the world financed the statue made by Thorwaldsen, the first statue ever of a German who was neither prince nor military commander. The Schiller festivals in 1859 still stand as the most powerful positive political demonstrations that ever happened in Germany. In countless cities in Germany, in all of Europe, among the German emigrants in America and elsewhere, Schiller's memory was celebrated. In schools, universities, churches, even in factories, a loud call for national unity was sung. And it is certain that Germany's fate would have taken a far more positive turn had the country been united in the spirit of Schiller as a republic, rather than under Bismarck, which happened thereafter. German culture, and especially Schiller's popularity, exerted an important influence on America throughout the 19th century. The 100th anniversary of Schiller's death in 1905 marked yet another Schiller Renaissance, but it was the last time when German culture was considered a genuine ingredient of America's heritage, before it was largely repressed by Teddy Roosevelt in the First World War. But as long as America remains separated from Schiller by ideological barriers, it will also remain separated from its soul, for no other poet eternalized the ideals of the American Revolution as he did. Friedrich Schiller was born 225 years ago on November 10th in Marbach. With his parents, Johann Caspar and Elisabetta, spent an extremely happy childhood there, later in Lorch, and then at the Latin school in Ludwigsburg. His happiness was only interrupted when Karl Eugen, the Duke of Württemberg, brought him into the Karl School, the Ducal Military Academy. Although Schiller suffered immensely, as he wrote himself, at this school where he had to stay from the time he was 13 to 21 years old, the influences which flowed upon him at that time became a wellspring of experience that would later be the source from which his poetic genius would explode. On the positive side, his mind developed under the influence, still felt in the 18th century, of Leibniz, Lessing, and Shakespeare, and among his teachers was one who was outstanding because he polemically challenged his students to develop themselves into geniuses, Friedrich Abel. Schiller developed a passionate aversion against the oligarchical despotism of the nobility, who brutally and thoughtlessly crushed the aspirations of their subjects, who carelessly destroyed an entire year's work of their peasants if it pleased them to stage a hunt with 300 horses. Schiller had a sharp political insight with which he exposed the covert operations of the oligarchical faction in his various works, such as The Ghost Seer. In his first drama, The Robbers, written by the 20-year-old Schiller secretly while he was still at the Karl School, a dramatic talent erupted that has no parallel in the German language. While dramas greater than The Robbers were to follow, Schiller already demonstrated what it was that distinguished him from all other playwrights. The ability to compose in such a gripping way that each line is born by necessity of the previous one, so that it is impossible to put down one of his dramas, no matter how many times one might have read it. Not to speak of the overwhelming effect of his dramas performed on the stage, which only a fool could possibly evade. Schiller's fellow students, in any case, who secretly attended the first performance of The Robbers, excitedly played entire scenes at night in the woods. The Robbers established Schiller's fame throughout Germany at a single stroke, soon throughout Europe. When Duke Karl Eugen forbid Schiller to write, forbid him any contact with foreign countries, even arrested him so that Schiller must have thought he would share the horrible fate of the poet Schubert, he decided to flee. His good friend, the composer and late collaborator of Beethoven, Andreas Streicher, made a great sacrifice to help Schiller escape. Doubtlessly, these were the experiences that Schiller worked up in his third drama. Cobbles and Love is the first play in which Schiller makes direct reference to the American Revolution. Not only did he put the entire duplicity and perfidy of contemporary life at court ruthlessly upon the stage, here he attacks the sale of Hessian soldiers to the English who were in the habit of throwing such soldiers as cannon fodder into the war against the American patriots. Cobbles and Love was to remain Schiller's last drama to so drastically make reference to the present time. The play was immediately forbidden after the premiere performance. In order to escape censorship in his late dramas, Schiller used the trick of shifting the great affairs of the present to earlier historical times. Whatever he wrote from then on, whether dramas, poems, historical or theoretical works, they were all born by the great idea of political freedom. And they all mirror the ideals successfully realized in the American Revolution, ideals that united all the ardent patriots of Europe. The famous Rütli Oath from Wilhelm Tell was directly taken from the American Declaration of Independence. When Christian Gottfried Körner helped Schiller out of personal difficulties, as he had many other Republicans, he was filled with optimism about the future of mankind. It was in Körner's house that Schiller composed the famous lines,
Freude schöner Götterfunken, Tochter aus Elysium. Wir betreten feuertrunken himmlische dein Heiligtum. Deine Zauber binden wieder, was die Mode streng geteilt. Alle Menschen werden Brüder, wo dein sanfter Flügel weilt.
This poem appeared in 1786, in the very decade when all of the Republicans of Europe gazed, full of enthusiasm, upon the successful American Revolution, a success in which they had a large share through the networks of Franklin, Washington, Lafayette, Steuben, and the League of Armed Neutrality. The American Revolution had really been their joint project to establish for the first time a free republic in the New World. They hoped that the beginning of the French Revolution would take a similarly happy turn, and that this would be the lever for all of Europe, and thus for Germany too, which still consisted of 300 small principalities, to become nations. Schiller describes the discussions about this perspective in the Letters on Don Carlos as the favorite topic of the decade, the establishment of a nation wherein the utmost flourishing of the state coincided with the maximum development of the individual. Don Carlos, together with Wilhelm Tell, is probably the drama representing the most direct celebration of the American Revolution. When the Marquis of Posa in Don Carlos takes the side of justice for the province of Flanders, this emissary of mankind speaks the words expressing the ideals that also moved the founding fathers. Schiller's dramatic method was to educate patriots who were at the same time world citizens. In the prologue to The Bride of Messina, he adds,
True art, however, is not intended as a mere passing fancy, Its earnest endeavor is not to transport man into a mere momentary dream of freedom, but rather to make him actually free, and to do so by awakening, exercising, and developing within him his power to achieve an objective distance from the sensible world, to transform it into the free work of our own intellect, and through ideas to exert dominion over the material world.
In another place, Schiller says,
"The stage is the common channel in which the light of wisdom streams down from the thinking, better part of the people, and flows from thence outward in softer beams through the entire nation."
Schiller was not only the greatest German dramatist, he also developed a philosophy of history that has not been surpassed to this day.
All previous generations have labored to bring about our epoch of mankind. All the treasures that labor and genius, reason and experience have brought forth in the long history of the world are ours. Who among you could bear this immense responsibility in mind without wanting to pay that debt to future generations that he can no longer pay to generations past? A path to immortality is open to those who merit it, where the deeds live on into future generations, even if the name of its author remains behind.
In the same year, 1789, as Schiller delivered his first address as professor of history in Jena, he composed the poem The Artists, a hymn to the reason of man.
Wie schön, o Mensch, mit deinem Palmenzweige stehst du an des Jahrhunderts Neige. In edler, stolzer Männlichkeit, mit aufgeschlossenem Sinn, mit Geistesfülle, voll milden Ernsts in tatenreicher Stille, der reifste Sohn der Zeit, frei durch Vernunft, stark durch Gesetze, durch Sanftmut groß und reich durch Schätze, die lange Zeit dein Busen dir verschwieg. Herr der Natur, die deine Fesseln liebet, die deine Kraft in 1000 Kämpfen übet und prangend unter dir aus der Verwilderung stieg.
In 1789, Schiller was firmly convinced that mankind found itself on the eve of the Age of Reason. The more the Jacobin terror crushed the hopes of the French Revolution, however, the more Schiller vented his horror at this barbarity. And Schiller, who had just composed the lines, "How beautiful, O man, with your palm branch, you stand upon the waning of the century," later reflected upon the Paris massacre in the Bell. Yet the most terrifying of terrors is man in his folly. The course of the French Revolution occasioned Schiller to the famous dictum that a great moment has found a little people. The hope of realizing a political order established on the principles of reason and freedom was gone. Schiller concentrated on the question of how this little people was now to be educated. In this period of the early 90s came Schiller's struggle with the work of Kant, who, with his categorical imperative, demanded that man must do his duty should a contradiction between necessity and inclination arise. Such a Kantian approach necessarily aroused the indignation of our freedom-loving poet, and so he wrote, "What crime have the children of the house committed, that he only takes care of the servants?" Schiller counterposed the idea of the beautiful soul, the emotion where reason and sensuousness, duty and inclination coincide. Friedrich Schiller died too young on May 12, 1805. There were so much more, infinitely more to quote from Schiller, so much more to say about him. Yet this brief sketch is really only a stimulus for those who wish to read and study Schiller themselves. Just as Schiller held forth the program of classical art against the endangered and crushed mankind of his time, reaching back to the heritage of the Greeks, Today, we too must link up with the ideal of mankind of the Weimar classics in order to unfold anew the whole of human nature with Schiller's method. If we put all the confusion of later history to one side and prove ourselves to be the honest discoverers who Schiller once hoped for, we will thereby have found the key not only to overcome the inner fissures of modern man, but rather, if we learn to think as great as Schiller, we will also have found the strength to master the great causes of mankind today. Great is he who overcomes the terrifying. Man is greater than his destiny.